So 'tis said that nothing's new beneath the sun, and that history is doomed to rhyme, since it is the story of man, and man won't change. When did he first fight his fellow, over passions of envy, pride, malice, and resentment? Wars are fought for land and money, but the duel has always seemed more personal, more intimate. In older days, better days, some would say, it was even declared that the strongest was in the right, and legal disputes settled through trial by combat. Was it not just that God would bestow his glory upon the one he deemed of a heart fair and righteous? In 1386, Jean de Carouge and Jacques Legris fought an epic duel in the open ground of a Parisian monastery, after Legris had forced himself upon the wife of de Carouge. Hundreds of spectators, even the king himself, witnessed the wounded party claim his revenge, as he forced the offender to the ground and let his sword resolve the rest. After the Reformation and with the death of medieval chivalry, trial by combat and sanctioned duels had become unfashionable, their destructiveness recognized. Thousands of French noblemen perished from duels in the 16th century, among them Henry of France, whose life ended after a jousting duel with the captain of his bodyguard. Splinters from the foe's shattered lance entered the king's helmet, piercing his eye and temple. For as many days as there are fingers on your hands, he lingered in incredible pain, before eventually passing to a different place. In 1571, the Court of London ordered trial by combat to resolve a dispute over land on the island of Harty in Kent. Thousands of spectators eagerly gathered, only to be disappointed by an intervention from the Queen. She had no wishes for needless bloodshed. This was the first step in eradicating the duel as a means of solving disputes. And although legislation was passed across Europe in the 17th century attempting to ban the practice, it would require 3 more centuries for it to be finally eradicated. Though both the French and English made attempts to eradicate dueling, the affair was only becoming more popular with the development of new codes of honor. A significant amount of different books, mostly Italian, were written on how gentlemen should behave in the face of an insult. The idea of meeting someone sword to sword was no doubt popularized by French fashion, not to mention theater plays portraying epic duels of honor and passion, such as Hamlet or Romeo and Juliet. In Elizabethan England, newspapers wrote of 5 duels in the 1580s. In the 90s, it has jumped to 20, and in the 1600s to 33. They would become even more popular in the 17th century, demanding legislation outlawing it. To little avail. The duel became a secretive and illegal affair. Whilst there were plenty of voices clamoring for an end to duels, the support was naturally ever present. It was argued that duels produced a society of fighters, and that it improved manners. People would be less inclined to insult or offend if there was a risk of dueling. In practice, it didn't seem to work out. The noble duel evolved alongside new fencing techniques. The rapier, a Spanish invention which every would-be don or hidalgo wore on his hip, had spread to the rest of Europe. It required extensive training to use effectively, as it was reliant on footwork, precision, and dexterity. It was soon rivaled in dueling by the small sword, often accompanied by a dagger, the broadsword and buckler, and even the cutlass. Fencing schools were opened up across Western Europe, often run by Italian experts, where a hefty sum could be paid to learn and prepare for the inevitable. Indeed, some noblemen took a perverted liking to fighting duels for the sake of it. The Chevalier d'Andrieux is supposed to have dueled and killed 72 men before his 30th birthday. He had a habit of forcing his defeated opponents to deny God on the pain of death, before he slit their throats anyway. In his words, he had a pleasure of killing both body and soul at the same time. Other duels were fought over poets, with 2 combatants arguing either for the superiority of Ariosto or Tasso. The victor said on his deathbed that he had read neither of them. Duels were conducted in a polite and ritualized fashion, systemized in the 17th century into a format that would more or less persist until the end of dueling. The duel began with some sort of slight, an insult to the honor of one party from another. This was followed by a challenge. If the one challenged refused, his honor would be forfeit, and many duels were fought simply because either party was too afraid to lose their honor. Next, a time and place was agreed upon where the duel was to be fought. It was usually somewhere isolated, well away from the prying eyes of the law. Here present was a surgeon to tend to the wounded party, and each fighter having a second. The second was a man he could rely upon. They were to supervise the duel to ensure that it was conducted fairly, with no cheating or unfair advantage. When duels would increasingly be fought with pistols instead of swords in the 18th century, the second was responsible for ensuring that the pistol was loaded, safe, and ready to fire. Finally, the combat itself. On paper, the purpose was not to kill, but simply to defeat the opponent, downing or drawing first blood. Few duels, especially in the 17th century, ended so fortunately. That is why the surgeon was present, even if he could not always be relied upon to be impartial. That makes it worth to describe the legendary duel in 1613 between Edward Sackville and Lord Bruce. Sackville left an unusually detailed account of the event. Like so many quarrels, it was fought over a woman. The two men, knowing duels were despised by the pacifistic King of England, sailed across the channel to the border between the United Provinces and Spanish Netherlands, so that the survivor could quickly escape to the country where the crime hadn't been committed. The seconds also wrote up very specific arrangements for the conduct of the fight itself. If either of the duelists was to slip or fall, he was to admit defeat. If a sword would break, it was agreed that neither opponent should take advantage of the other's misfortune. If it so happened, they should attempt a reconciliation or renew the fight on equal terms. The duel was fought in a marsh, ankle-deep in water, and it soon devolved into a muddy, sloppy wrestling match. Both men were wounded when Bruce grappled onto Sackville, seizing his sword, or, as Sackville wrote, "And so grappling together, he got hold on his sword, and now in his, and there we wrestle for the two greatest prizes we could ever expect trial for, honor and life." Both men soon ended up breathless and weak, but with a kick and a wrench, Sackville managed to free his sword, laying it at Bruce's throat and claiming his sword. He asked his opponent to surrender, the man refusing. Sackville, close to fainting from blood loss, aimed at Bruce's heart, but missed, stabbing him 2 times, until the surgeon cried out for him to stop, saying he would die. Sackville asked if Bruce would accept the surgeon's help, and he did. As the surgeon treated the wounds of Sackville, he suddenly grabbed Bruce's sword and attempted to run his patient through. Sackville narrowly parried the blow with his own blade, and he would surely have been slain had the dying Bruce not demanded his surgeon stop. He passed away shortly thereafter. Sackville survived. The surgeon's move was a serious breach of dueling etiquette, and had he succeeded in his scheme, would have been severely punished. Indeed, neither surgeons nor seconds could always be relied upon, as they might be swayed or bribed to tamper with the combat. Nonetheless, duels could happen outside of the ritualized format. Wherever there was honor to be slighted, there could be a duel. In a bar over too many drinks, in a dark alley, even at the royal court. In 1663, Naval Secretary Samuel Pepys writes the following. "Their talk about a ridiculous falling out 2 days ago at my Lord of Oxford's house at an entertaining of his, or there was high words and some blows and pulling off of periwigs, till my Lord Monk took away some of their swords and sent for some soldiers to guard the house until the fray was ended. To such a degree of madness the nobility of this age is come." Sometimes not even blades were needed. Nobles, fops, and would-be gentlemen were not the only ones to settle their disputes by farce. So too did the lower classes. Nobles fought with sword and pistol, weapons much too expensive for those who struggled for a living. Sometimes they were held back by class restrictions on swords, and were forced into using much more rudimentary, but armaments equally murderous. Quarterstaves, cudgels, and knives, or simply the weapons granted by the maker. Dutch workmen and sailors favored the knife, settling their disputes in a fashion almost identical to the formal duel. English sailors were not permitted to take cutlasses ashore, preferring cudgels instead. Another seaman's favorite was the slung shot. This was a piece of grape shot, essentially a big bullet, wrapped up in cord and tied into a sling. Think a flail. The rope from which they were slung were often intricately braided during days of boredom, a somewhat sweet activity, in contrast to their concerning purpose. In the armed forces, nothing is valued as much as camaraderie, the bonding spirit between those who are to fight and die together. It is the glue holding the army together. It is therefore a great irony that duels were incredibly common among soldiers of the early modern age, not only in idle times of peace, but raging war. One has only to look at the career of Donald McBane, a Scottish soldier who fought as many as 100 duels during his life. He eventually retired as a fencing master, teaching others how to defend their honor. In his fencing manuals is likewise included an account of his life, perhaps dramatized or conveniently misremembered in some parts. But the authenticity of his teachings and their widespread use points to Donald having more bite than bark. McBane fought his first duel in 1697, after his corporal accused him of absence of guard, punishing him with a beating. His soldier's honor challenged, McBane wounded the corporal mortally and had to escape for his life. After a streak of mishmash adventures, McBane fought a fencing master in Ireland over his sister, and travelled next with the army to Holland. Here he set up a fencing school after proving his worth by dueling rival masters, seemingly for the heck of it. Marching off with the army, he not only fought in the lines and trenches, but served the camp as a pimp, providing his battle buddies with quote-unquote brave Dutch lasses. It was often disputed to which pimp and camp these girls belonged, and so duels were fought over them. On other occasions, soldiers refused to pay, and they had to be dueled as well. So much for discipline. With the discovery of the New World, there was a distant hope that man could establish a new Eden, liberated from the boundaries and conflicts of the Old World. This ambition died almost sooner than it had been conceived, and the tendency of cruelty would haunt the settler as he made his way across the Atlantic. Less than a year after the foundation of the Plymouth colony, a duel was fought between two Edwards, Doughty and Leicester. Nothing is known about the duel. Of people in the Caribbean, Francis Rogers wrote the following. These Creoles are generally of a fiery hot temper, haughty and apt to command and domineer. They seldom want courage, being too forward in dueling on very slight occasions, standing much on their honour, and scorning base litigious actions. Sword, or sword and pistol, is the common challenge to decide where fronts, except among the ordinary or seafaring people. There, if you see your cutlass, is the weapon. They prefer the field of honour over the courts of law, which they consider the refuge of a coward, especially a rich coward. Their reasons for fighting were the same as their overseas cousins. For insults, disputes, political or religious, for lovers, or a game of cards. Masters of this new land of infinite possibilities, they saw themselves as an upper class of sorts, a new aristocracy, and one that needed to uphold their standards of honor. And so came the expectations of violent preservation. Pirates were no different. As independent men who obeyed no masters, sailed and plundered on their own accord, and took what they wanted and carried arms, they believed themselves superior to the common man, he who worked for a living and killed himself working. However, whilst duels might seem like they were extraordinarily common among pirates if viewed in isolation, it must be remembered how common they were in the rest of society. It was a violent trend repeated by everyone living in a violent time. Unlike sailors from back home, Caribbean buccaneers always carried their arms with them, unless forbidden by the local governor. A rare case. This further increased the likelihood of erupting duels. The sword and pistol were the most popular, but the Buccaneer, the piratical hunters on Hispaniola, settled their differences with their long and iconic muskets. The Buccaneer gun. The duelists began at some distance away from each other, perhaps 50 to 100 yards, and fired by turn. The first man to fire was determined by lot. to ensure that the outcome was discerned by skill, not by luck. Projectiles were limited to a single bullet. Hopefully, a surgeon or second was present to determine the fairness of the duel. The body was inspected for signs of treachery, such as entry wounds in the back or side. You were only allowed to fire at the opponent facing you. Anyone who cheated was punished by being tied to a tree and shot in the head. This style of dueling was likewise adapted by the filibusters and Buccaneers. Indeed, Buccaneers took the duel with them to sea and implemented it as part of their customs and regulations and how to settle disputes between their crewmen. It did not become cemented in written codes until the early 18th century, but judging by eyewitness accounts, both from pirates and observers, duels were a crucial component of their judicial culture. Article 8 of the purported Code of Bartholomew Roberts reads as follows: "No striking one another on board, but every man's quarrels to be ended on shore, at sword and pistol." If the two parties could not reconcile, the quartermaster would accompany them ashore with any surgeons or seconds he deemed appropriate, and turn the disputants back to back at some distance. At the word of command, they turned and fired immediately, or the pistol was knocked out of their hands. If both of them missed, they fell together with their cutlasses, and the victor was the first to draw blood. Crucial here was that duels were never to be fought at sea. For one, the environment of a ship is unsuitable for it. Pirate ships were especially small and littered with ropes, hatches, and other parts necessary for handling the vessel. Deck space was needed for sailing the ship, and in the cramped confinements, other pirates risked getting hurt. The various parts of the ship could also end up hurting the combatants, or the ship might come about and bring them off their feet. It was altogether unsuitable for a formal duel. Even still, there are cases of shipboard duels, and on the vessel of Richard Taylor, the pirates busied themselves practicing with wooden swords. But this was a far stretch from the armed resolution of disputes aboard a ship. Even if a duel could technically be fought on the ship, there was a symbolic reason for not doing so. A duel regarding a personal dispute would involve the entire crew and distract them from their duties. The pirate's life was dangerous. They had to focus on sailing, pillaging, and surviving. Teamwork came first and foremost, and thus, personal disputes had no place aboard a ship. They literally had to be moved to land, and only there could they be solved, before the duelists, now reconciled by arms, could return aboard and back to their regular duties. This wasn't necessarily something unique to pirates. In 1722, two masters of merchant ships went ashore to settle their grievances. That is not to say that fights did never break out at sea. In one documented instance at sea, Captain Bartholomew Sharp fired a pistol at Richard Hendricks over some unknown dispute. Indeed, we are seldom given a reason as to why a duel erupted between two pirates. Writing in his journal, Buccaneer Basil Ringerus documented how he and the crew landed on an island, and that he fought a duel there against the quartermaster, James Chappell. Ironic, because the quartermaster was the one supposed to resolve disputes. I guess he did. It is only mentioned in a passing sentence, with most of the segment describing a slave uprising. Clement Downing, an East India merchant looking to buy provisions from the pirates of Madagascar, said how they frequently show the wickedness of their dispositions by quarreling and fighting with each other upon the most trifling occasions. It was their custom never to go abroad, except armed with pistols or a naked sword in their hand, to be in readiness to defend themselves or to attack others. Most trifling occasions could have meant anything, political or religious disagreements, or most definitely, drunken tomfoolery. Piracy was a violent profession, and they cultivated a violent society, in which they were often drunk or at least tipsy, kinda like me right now. This often had a severe effect on discipline, and pirate captains, elected by their men for a supposed proficiency, always lived on the knife's edge. If they would somehow displease their crewmen, they could face a re-election, mutiny, or worse. A captain could get back into their good graces by bringing them good plunder, or exceeding them in machismo. Violence, duels, or the threat of duels could therefore be used as a tool to maintain control. The duel itself did not even need to happen. A threat started was often enough to start a sort of duel of words and confidence, which would eventually end in one party backing down. The captain just needed to have the backbone, and that alone could earn him the respect he needed to maintain authority. Captain Johnson tells us of such an incident in the story of Captain Evans, a pirate who stumbled into a dispute with the ship's bosun. The bosun was a quote-unquote noisy, surly fellow, apparently an annoyance, and Evans tried at multiple points to reason with him and make him quit. The bosun took offense to this, started swearing at Evans, and challenged him to a duel the next time they came ashore. When the time came, the captain proposed a duel. The bosun proved to be a coward and refused, even if it was his own challenge. To further cement his authority, Evans drew his cane and ruthlessly punished the bosun. This did not stop the rebellious knave, who drew his pistol and shot his captain in the head. Having done this, he jumped overboard and tried to swim ashore, but was caught and executed. Johnson is not always considered a reliable narrator, but we do have other instances of pirate captains maintaining their authority through direct violence or threats of it. A prime example is the hot-headed captain William Kidd. According to a former crewman of Kidd, Mason, the Scottish commander was a very lusty man, fighting with his own men on any little occasion, often calling for his pistols and threatening anyone that dares speak of anything contrary to his mind to knock out their brains, causes them to dread him. Now, some historians dispute Mason's authenticity, being an enemy of Kidd and certainly not wishing him well, but all evidence points to Kidd being hot-headed and rude. His alleged promises would eventually come to a head when he knocked a bucket into the head of a mutinous gunner, William Moore. Similar to Kidd was Richard Taylor. He was part of a pirate gang with a long history of internal disputes and mutinies, in which the deposed captains had been marooned. He had been responsible for a few of them. This had turned him into a paranoid wreck, and a prisoner described how he would often wake up in a panic in the middle of the night, reaching for his pistols. He was easily angered, and whenever he feared a revolt, he would launch himself into the group of mutinous pirates and just beat them up. There is some evidence of Taylor being a former Royal Navy officer, and it isn't impossible that he transferred naval ideas of discipline aboard his pirate ship. These methods of violence as a means to maintain authority shouldn't be seen as something unique to pirates. Sailors in general were a rowdy sort, so merchant and navy captains alike often saw the need to discipline them. Taylor had likewise noted at least some of the reasons for disputes breaking out, and his articles forbade quarrels and insults between crewmen, religious disputes, and gambling for money. These must end up in the most common causes for a fight, but still they would arise, so the articles listed their rules for duels. The quartermaster and captain presided over the duel, which only ended with one man dying. A flag was then waved over the head of the victor. Of note is that there is no mention of the duel being fought ashore. Pirates fighting over treasure might seem a bit too romantic to be true, and whilst they mostly managed to divide their plunder squarely, there is at least one documented instance of pirates dueling over their ill-gotten gains. Once again, we sail to the wild island of Madagascar. Here a pirate prisoner explained how he had heard of 14 of the scoundrels, variously belonging to Captains Tew, Rayner, Mason, and Coates, had divided themselves into 2 groups of 7 to fight each other in a group duel over who should keep the spoils of their adventure. The reason for this dispute was that the pirates did not think that they had made enough money that could be divided into satisfactory payouts. In the end, one of the groups was entirely wiped out, and 5 from the other, so that only 2 survivors were left to claim the entire treasure for themselves. Group duels of this kind were not uncommon for army regiments in garrison or winter quarters, the most convenient time to settle their grievances. Each regiment would choose their best swordsmen to fight those of the other. On some occasion, only 2 men would fight at a time, the victor staying to fight the next until he was defeated, and another would take his place. At other times, they all fought at once, in teams. Once again, we return to Donald McBane, who conveniently described such a compound duel for us. The Scotsmen had stolen 14 prostitutes from a Dutch regiment, and the next day, 24 of them came and demanded the lassies again, or satisfaction by the sword. Donald gathered 23 others and drank with them before they engaged the Dutchman. The teams fought in small teams of 2v2, with 11 of the Dutchmen killed and 7 English. With the Englishmen victorious, the Dutch had to pay them a tribute. However, the Dutch did not pay up, and when 6 of the English were sent to collect, 4 of them were shot. Contrary to the well-trained fencers of Europe, the dashing sires with their rapiers and apiece, it is unlikely that the average pirate duel looked anything like it. The average buccaneer or pirate, a run-down sailor, escaped slave or servant, a scoundrel and a knave, was unlikely to ever have afforded the classes from a fencing master the likes of McBane. Their training ground was aboard the deck of a ship, in the heat of combat. Close quarters packed together, there was little space for fancy footwork, and just about getting in and doing it dirty. As described by Francis Rogers, the fusee or cutlass was the favorite weapon of the seafaring people. The cutlass, a short, heavy, and brutal weapon, required scarce training to use effectively. The fusee, or flintlock musket, was the pirate's favorite weapon, owing to its flexibility. However, Rogers' description of the sword, or the sword and pistol being the Caribbean gentleman's favorite, might indicate that when pirates implemented these weapons into their codified duels, it might have been part of a trend to try and imitate the upper classes. Pirates did, after all, view themselves as the aristocracy of the sea. Even still, it is unlikely that their duels would ever have been a graceful affair. Pirate captains never seemed to have dueled over the command of a company. It was up to the crews to elect the best man, not for it to be decided by some medieval right. Of course, captains could and would come to blows, but not over disputes of leadership, necessarily. Closest we have is a duel fought between Lawrence de Graaf and Nicholas van Horn on Isla de los Sacrificios, or the Island of Sacrifice, located just off Veracruz. The island is so named because it had been the site of a sacrificial temple for the native inhabitants. Van Horn had led a pirate armada against the Spanish city, sacking and occupying it for a couple of weeks. Whilst waiting for a ransom, the 4,000 captured denizens were herded like cattle down the shore and off to Sacrifice Island, where they were kept under deplorable conditions beneath the baking sun. An argument here erupted between Van Horn and de Graaf. Van Horn drew his sword and advanced upon de Graaf with obvious intent. De Graaf drew his own and cut Van Horn's wrist, wounding him so severely as to make him drop his sword. He then kicked his opponent into the sand, and the duel had ended as quickly as it had begun. Van Horn was taken aboard one of the ships and clapped in irons, where he succumbed to an infection and perished. So, what happened? It is not entirely certain why the argument started. According to Sir Thomas Lynch of Jamaica, Van Horn wished to attack the Spanish treasure fleet, but de Graaf declined, either because he had enough plunder, or out of jealousy of Van Horn, for which Van Horn called him a coward. An Arab traveller said that they quarrelled over the division of plunder. Exquemelin, an old buccaneer himself, said that little is known of the dispute, only that a buccaneer told Lawrence that Nicholas had insulted him, and when confronted, Nicholas denied it. A French account simply said that they had a difference. You don't say. A modern account, based on various Spanish documents, says that Van Horn, furious over the Spanish refusing to pay the ransom, planned on decapitating a number of prisoners and sending the heads as a morbid message to Mexico City. De Graaf was apparently angered over this and swiftly got to the island before the chopping could take place. Either way, the duel happened. Lawrence won with a masterful stroke of his sword. Van Horn perished, and no further disputes arose in the company. They divided their plunder and parted ways. In the account of Dr. David van der Ster, writing of the buccaneer Erasmus Reining, a duel is recorded between Reining and his superior, Roque Brasiliano, concerning an insult against Reining's friend, Gel de Lecat. De Lecat had recently lost his ship and stayed with Roque as an officer, but they struggled to get along. In one of his typical fits of rage, Roque beat Lecat on the shoulder with his cutlass, and Reining challenged him to a duel. Roque, a violent man, known for drunkenly chasing people in Port Royal with a cutlass and killing sharks by diving amongst them with daggers, could hardly refuse. He immediately called for 2 cutlasses. The duel was allegedly fought then and there on the deck of the ship. A ring of men formed around them to mark the arena, and both duelists laid down money for the surgeon to treat the wounded. It was on. The duelist came to blows. Raining took a strike near his stomach, on his knee, with Rock having his chin and forehead wounded. Perhaps blood started to pour into his eyes, for Rock lost initiative, and when pressed against the foremast, he had to surrender. Raining had won, but hard feelings remained. Rock ordered the surgeon not to treat Raining, so the victor had to threaten to throw the medicine chest overboard, risking the health of the entire crew. While the ship anchored at the Cayman Islands, Rock was apparently preparing for another duel, and Raining prepared his pistols. It was of no use, and the 2 pirates split up. Perhaps that was for the best. A lot of you watching engage in various forms of creative endeavors, ranging from novel writing to game design. Some of you have expressed interest or contacted me for consultation in your projects. So with the advice from one of my clients, I have set up a Fiverr account where you can now hire me to consult on your project. I offer research, proofreading, editing, and critique. Or we can just spitball ideas. You'll find a link in the video description or pinned comment below. Otherwise, support Gold Gunpowder by liking the video, giving your thoughts on the video, subscribing, and clicking the notification bell. Monetarily by buying some merch or becoming a Patreon supporter, where $1 a month gets you early, ad-free, and sponsor-free access to my videos.